So sure, he was the master of the world, yet he chose to invade its dark, terrifying edge. In the midst of the Gallic Wars, Caesar learned his Gallic enemies were receiving aid from the unknown land of Britain. This is the story of how that invasion was shattered, not by warriors, but by the sea itself, and why that failure was the key to his ultimate success. Now, the full story of the two invasions, the desperate battles, and the storms that changed history. On Torino, the strategic situation was locked in a bloody stalemate, unfolding in the middle of the 1st century BC. Julius Caesar, proconsul of Rome, found himself mired in a brutal and difficult campaign across the breadth of Gaul. This was not a simple war of conquest, it was an exercise in futility. The tribes of Gaul were a fractured, fiery people, brilliant in the charge but quick to despair, and just as quick to rise again. Caesar had spent years mastering this chaotic chessboard. He had driven back the Helvetii, yet the war ground on. The cost in Roman lives was mounting, but the cost in Gallic lives was a catastrophe. Still, they resisted. As soon as he managed to suppress a rebellion in one corner of the vast country, another would immediately ignite at the opposite end. The legions were marching in endless circles, putting out fires that were deliberately being relit. Caesar, a man of profound intellect and strategic patience, knew this was not sustainable. He sought the root of the infection, the source of the weapons and grain and fresh fighters that kept the resistance alive. His gaze drifted north beyond the familiar shores of Gaul, to a place that existed more in rumor than in fact. Aona, there lay an inhospitable and unknown land, a damp, dark island the Romans truly believed was the literal edge of the world, Britannia. It was a place of myth, shrouded in fog and fear, a land of savages and druids. But it was not its mystery that concerned Caesar, it was its politics. In his own writings on the Gallic War, Caesar himself noted that the southeast of Britain maintained extremely close ties, both cultural and commercial, with Gaul. These were not distant acquaintances, they were kinsmen. Caesar's intelligence reported that many of the Belgae, from the northeast of Gaul, had established colonies on the Britain coastal areas centuries before. These settlers were farmers, miners, and warriors. Crucially, these ambitious leaders retained power and influence on both sides of the narrow sea. And as Caesar discovered, these Celtic Britons were actively aiding their Gallic kinsmen in their desperate fight against Roman authority.
The transcription is not needed.
This was the source of the endless rebellion. The Briton support provided weapons, refuge for defeated Gallic chieftains, and a constant stream of morale to the Gallic resistance. For Caesar, the equation became simple and cold. He could not secure Gaul until he cut the supply line. He could not win his war by only fighting on the continent. Therefore, he made the monumental decision to launch an expedition into those unknown lands, to combat an enemy that had, until now, remained indirect. He would take the war to the edge of the world. Yet the crossing was never a simple matter. The gods of the ocean themselves seemed to protest. Despite the first invasion ultimately launching in 55 BC, Caesar had every intention of crossing into Britain a full year earlier. His ambition was checked by the realities of his chaotic command. The legions were ready, the ships were being built, but the continent would not let him go. So he was delayed first by a sudden and violent Gallic rebellion among the Veneti in the region of modern-day Brittany, forcing him to divert his legions to fight a difficult naval war. No sooner had that been contained, he was forced to turn east to deal with several significant Germanic incursions across the Rhine. Sorry, he had to build his famous bridge, march his legions across, and then dismantle it, all to prove that Roman power was not limited by rivers. These delays were frustrating, but perhaps they were not accidental. The historian Strabo, analyzing the events, wrote that these Gallic uprisings were no coincidence. Tricune, they were a deliberate, coordinated attempt to disrupt and halt the planned Roman invasion of Britain. The Gauls knew what Caesar intended, and they feared the severing of their alliance with the Britons more than they feared the Roman legions. The resistance was not just military, it was economic. Caesar, in his pragmatic way, tried to gather intelligence for his expedition. And he summoned the Gallic merchants, the men who regularly crossed the channel in their trade ships. They were calling, but when Caesar questioned them, the merchants refused to provide him with any useful information about Britain. They spoke of harbors but could not name them. They spoke of landing sites but described them vaguely. They were protecting their partners, their kinsmen, their profits. This wall of silence proved beyond any doubt just how close the contact between the Gauls and Britons truly was. Phthia, the island was not as isolated as the Romans believed. In fact, when the Romans finally set sail, their approach was immediately spotted. Warning fires must have been lit on the Gallic cliffs, mirrored by fires on the Briton side. By the time the Roman fleet reached the Briton coast, the islanders were already massed in strong defensive positions on the cliffs above. Assuredly, the warning had been sent. The element of surprise was utterly lost. A fleet of approximately 80 ships, carrying 2 full legions, the 7th and the 10th, finally arrived off the coast of the island. But the sight that greeted them was terrifying. The defenders, who had been warned of their arrival, were positioned high atop the white cliffs, holding the high ground and maintaining a strong defense. They were a horrifying sight, painted, howling, brandishing spears and shields. Shiburnate, their shouts carried on the wind, were a wordless threat that even the disciplined legionaries understood. Caesar's captains steered the ships along the coast, searching for a viable beach, but the Britons shadowed them on the cliffs above. There was no clear landing zone. For several hours, the Romans were held at bay, unable to land. The fleet milled in the water, a perfect target for slings and arrows. The transports were heavy, wallowing in the swell. The legionaries were sailors second and soldiers first, and many felt the unfamiliar lurch of the sea in their stomachs. The legionaries, veterans of countless land battles, were now acosados, harassed, worried, and deeply uneasy. They were faced with the horrifying prospect of jumping into deep water, weighed down by their full equipment, and attempting to form ranks on a hostile beach. The Pilum, the Gladius, the Heavy Scutum, and the Lorica Segmentata, all of it weighing them down. To jump meant to sink, to stay meant to be a target. For hours, they remained aboard their ships, paralyzed by indecision. The operation was failing. Suddenly, a single moment broke the stalemate. The Aquilifer of the 10th Legion, Caesar's most trusted legion, seeing the hesitation, performed a truly heroic gesture. He was a man whose name is lost, but whose action is immortal. He grasped the legion's silver eagle standard, the Aquila, the very soul of the legion. To lose it was a disgrace worse than any death. Warder, he raised his voice over the wind. Leap, fellow soldiers, unless you wish to betray the eagle to the enemy. I, for my part, shall have done my duty to the Republic and to my general.
my duty to the Republic and to Caesar.
Araiki, with that, he leaped from the ship into the waves. The splash was a clarion call. In that instant, the entire legion, shamed and inspired by his courage, followed him. A great shout went up from the 10th. Men plunged into the water, forgetting the depth, forgetting the weight, driven only by the primal fear of shame and the honor of their eagle. He then sent word back to Gaul for his cavalry to be brought over, dispatching 18 ships to ferry them across the channel. Which the legions were the body of his army, but the cavalry was its eyes and its killing strike. But then, the true master of Britain intervened. Wakade, it started as a shift in the wind. The sky, clear moments before, turned a bruised, sickly purple. A storm of such magnitude arose that the 18 cavalry transports, caught in the open water, lost their bearings entirely. This was not a Mediterranean squall. This was an Atlantic fury. The tempest was so violent that they were scattered, their pilots blinded by spray, their hulls groaning. The horses, terrified, screamed in the holds. But the disaster was only beginning. The same bad weather and enraged sea that repelled the cavalry then turned on the infantry transports anchored off the beach. These were the heavier ships, the ones that carried the legions, now anchored and empty. The storm surge combined with a high tide ripped them from their anchors. Ships were hurled onto the beach. Others were smashed into one another, their oar banks splintering, their hulls breached. Many were simply swallowed by the sea, dragged down and destroyed. In a single night, Caesar's victory evaporated. The dawn revealed a graveyard of ships, a testament to the ocean's power. Despite their initial triumph, the Romans were suddenly and completely stranded. Their faces etched with the pride of victory just days before, were now pale with a new primal fear. They were on the wrong side of the world with no food and no way home. The Briton tribes who had just sued for peace saw the wrecked fleet and the Romans' desperate situation. The envoys who had been bowing and scraping suddenly vanished. Promises of tribute and hostages were forgotten. They saw not demigods, but shipwrecked men. For them, the truce was broken, and the Britons immediately began launching opportunistic guerrilla attacks against the Roman foraging parties. It began with small foraging parties disappearing. Then sudden, sharp attacks on the perimeter of the Roman camp. Chariots would appear from the mist, hurl javelins, and vanish before a cohort could even form up. This was a war of ghosts and shadows. The situation became a total stalemate. Caesar the Conqueror was now a castaway, fighting for survival. He put his men to work. To run, they cannibalized the wrecks, salvaging timber, rope, and sails. Every legionary became a carpenter, every centurion a foreman. was a race against time, starvation, and the increasingly bold Britons. After some time with the situation hopelessly deadlocked, Caesar managed to patch together enough of his wrecked fleet to limp back to Gaul with his legions. The crossing was a miserable, cramped affair on vessels that were barely seaworthy. Unreassuring, but they made it. Despite the near disaster, the propaganda of the expedition was potent. Caesar wrote his dispatches to the Senate. He framed the expedition not as a retreat, but as a reconnaissance in force. He had dared to cross the ocean. Rome, obsessed with firsts, was ecstatic. For this great achievement, crossing the ocean and setting foot on the edge of the world, the Senate in Rome granted Caesar 20 days of honor and encouraged him to return the following year. Caesar was a man who learned from failure. He had been beaten, not by the Britons, but by the sea. In 54 BC, he returned to Britain. This was not a reconnaissance, this was a conquest. This time, he came with a larger and significantly improved invasion force. He brought not 80 ships, but over 800. He brought 5 legions and 2,000 cavalry. He had personally designed new ships himself, wider, with a shallower draft, and purpose-built for the Britain beaches. He had adapted from the hard lessons he had learned the previous year. The landing this time was entirely unopposed. The sheer size of the armada, a forest of mass filling the horizon, had struck terror into the Britons. Amid they had fled the coast. He met resistance at a river, but the 7th Legion stormed the Briton hill fort. But as night was about to fall, Caesar was forced to return to the beach to make camp. A dispatch rider had arrived, his horse lathered, his face grim. The ocean had returned. Caesar returned to the coast and discovered that the curse of Britain had struck again. Oh no, his fleet, his lifeline to Gaul, had once more suffered from the terrible weather. A different kind of storm, this one striking the anchored ships. They had dragged their anchors and smashed into each other in the swell. Approximately 40 of his ships anchored in the channel had been wrecked. Dozens of others were severely damaged. It was a catastrophe, a repeat of the nightmare from 55 BC. The legionaries must have felt a cold dread. This island was cursed. Following this disaster, the Roman army's advance was halted. Caesar, a man of iron will, refused to despair. He gave the orders. The Romans see Passer in 10 days with their knights. They spent 10 days and 10 nights, not as soldiers, but as shipwrights, repairing as many of the damaged vessels as they possibly could. They worked under armed guard around the clock. They hauled the entire remaining fleet onto the beach. At Launry, they built a massive fortified palisade around the ships, connecting it to the main Roman camp. It was an engineering marvel born of pure desperation. When Caesar was finally able to return to the interior, he discovered the political landscape had changed. 10-day delay had given the Britons time to organize.
Ambush them here before they reach the fort.
If we stand united, Caesar will fall.
He found the Britons were no longer fractured. The disaster with the fleet had bought them time. A single powerful leader had risen, Cassivellaunus, leader of the Cativellauni tribe, who had taken up arms against the Romans. He was a war chief from north of the Thames, a brilliant and ruthless man. He had forced the other tribes into a coalition under his supreme command. After a few initial skirmishes, Cassivellaunus proved to be a brilliant tactician. He had learned the lesson of the previous year's beach battle. He immediately realized that he could not defeat the Roman legions in a pitched open battle, so he changed the rules of the war. Therefore, he reverted to the only strategy that could work: guerrilla warfare. He used his forces' superior mobility, particularly their war chariots, and their intimate knowledge of the territory to great effect. This was a form of warfare the Romans had never seen. A chariot would charge the Roman line, the warrior would hurl his javelins, and then the driver would wheel the horses around in the middle of the Roman formation, pick up the warrior, and speed away. It was terrifying, unpredictable, and highly effective at slowing the Roman advance. Caesar's cavalry was useless against them. Cassivellaunus's men knew every forest, every swamp, every trail. They stripped the countryside bare of food, forcing Caesar's supply lines to stretch thin. Cassivellaunus's strategy culminated at the River Thames. Quirine, he would make his stand here, at the border of his own territory. Knowing the Romans must cross, the Britons, without losing a single second, fortified the only fordable place on the river. Suro, they had driven thousands of sharpened, fire-hardened stakes into the riverbank and the riverbed itself, hidden just below the water surface. His main army was arrayed on the high ground on the far bank. It was a formidable defensive line. But the fortification, while clever, was not solid enough to stop the determination of the legions. Caesar's scouts identified the trap. He sent his cavalry upstream and downstream to swim the river and attack the flanks. At the same time, the legions, led by the 10th, charged the ford. They waded into the water, holding their shields above their heads, ignoring the stakes and the rain of javelins. The sheer, relentless force of the Roman charge broke the Briton line. The Romans crossed the Thames. Cassivellaunus's army melted away into the forest. This crossing of the Thames was the military turning point, and it triggered a political collapse within the Briton alliance. The Briton alliance, held together by fear of Rome and the charisma of Cassivellaunus, began to crack. At this precise moment, Mandubracius, the leader of the Trinovantes, made a fateful calculation. Now he saw his chance for revenge. He saw in Caesar not just an invader, but a powerful ally who could settle his own local disputes. He approached Caesar's camp under a flag of truce. He offered the allegiance of the Trinovantes. He offered grain for Caesar's hungry army, and he offered intelligence.
This is where he keeps his reserves. It is lightly guarded.
Caesar, the ultimate political operator, instantly agreed. He reinstated Mandubracius as king, placing him under Roman protection. The dam of Briton resistance had broken,